Logic 0, example 19.1. Denying the antecedent proved invalid. All right, so I want to talk about denying the antecedent, but I also want to talk about, before we get to that, modus ponens, which is affirming the antecedent. So the form of modus ponens, if you look a little bit further up in the text, is this form. So first premise, P only if Q. Second premise, P. Conclusion, therefore, Q. So we have two premises and a conclusion, and this form is actually valid. And we can prove that it is valid by a truth table. So all of our work in developing truth table analysis is now coming to fruition, especially as we look at these common argument forms. And modus ponens is the most famous. And we see that there are two variables. And now here, when we talk about common argument forms, it is common to use P and Q rather than A, B, C, D, because we want to think when we see these forms like P and Q with P and Q in them, we want to think that P could be anything. P could be a complex statement. So we could replace P with like A or B, the statement A or B. And we could replace Q with like D and C. So when we look at these common argument forms, we want to think of them more as templates or patterns that can that we can fit a lot of arguments into. I'll talk more about that later, but just a heads up on why we are using P and Q instead of A, B, C, etc. Okay, so if we're doing a truth table here, we're going to have two variables. So we have our familiar setup for a two-variable truth table. We'll copy over the values of P, skip material consequence, copy over the values of Q, and then evaluate the material consequence. It's only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Otherwise, it is true. We get underscore for the comma separating the two statements or propositions. And we get the values of P here as capital letters, and another column of underscores for the colon. The colon is logical consequence. The only if operation, material consequence. Material consequence has to do with facts in the world. It makes a claim about facts in the world, and it occurs within a proposition. It occurs within a statement, within a sentence. Logical consequence, which has some similarities to material consequence, but is not identical with it. Logical consequence makes a claim about logic, and it is not about facts in the world. It's about the logical relationships among propositions, and it occurs between propositions, or between statements, or between sentences. And what modus ponens claims here is that these two statements, P only if Q, the first statement, and the second statement, P, those two statements logically imply that Q, or that Q is true. So that's the claim of modus ponens. And it is an argument. And since we're given an argument, we're going to test to see if this argument is valid. And validity, as demonstrated in the structure of our truth table test here, that concept of validity is intimately tied to logical consequence. If an argument involving, which necessarily involves logical consequence, if an argument that necessarily involves logical consequence is valid, then that logical implication of logical consequence is valid. And if the argument is invalid, then this claim of logical consequence is invalid. So the idea of validity and the idea of logical consequence, those are intimately connected, and they mutually define one another. Okay, so we copy over the values of Q, and then we look for significant rows where both premises are true. This is a significant row, and the conclusion is true. So that substantiates to some degree the validity of the argument, but we got to see if there's any gotchas. And not a significant row, not a significant row. So those are not significant. And the final row is also not significant. Okay, so the argument is valid. And I give this truth table a little bit up above in the text in the previous chapter, so you can always take a look at that. Notice when we talk about these common argument forms, we're using P and Q because we can substitute in more complex statements for P and Q, and we try to keep the number of variables relatively small, and then our truth tables are relatively small, and our truth tables are very informative. Okay, so this is a nice use of truth tables, as we saw before. When we start getting 6, 7, etc. variables, then truth tables start to lose their ability to communicate anything. But this truth table actually, now that you've practiced doing truth tables, this actually tells you something. This tells you that this form, modus ponens, is valid. And you can take that to the bank. You can hold on to that. And whenever you see an argument that follows the modus ponens form, you can just look at it and you say, oh, that's modus ponens, that's valid. You don't have to do a truth table all over again. So that's what we're going to work on, is recognizing these forms in arguments that have more complex propositions, but nonetheless follow these patterns, or sometimes students like the word template. These are templates that arguments can be fit into. Okay, modus ponens. Very good. And of course, we can put in whatever we want for P and Q. So in this example here, let's see, I didn't really lay it out, but here we have P. Well, let's just go ahead and do that. Let's say P is equal to Socrates is an Athenian, and Q is equal to, and let's just say Socrates is mortal. And so if we think of modus ponens as a pattern or a template, P only if Q, P therefore Q, we can insert these English propositions into this modus ponens template, and then we just know, because we've already done the truth table, we know that it's a valid argument. And we could really put any sort of statements in here that we like, and it's going to be a valid argument. So we could say Socrates is an Athenian, and we'll do this in pseudo-English, only if Socrates is mortal. And then, so that's P only if Q. So P, notice how it's in order, not changing the order, nothing surprising. This is P. P, Socrates is an Athenian. I'm just replacing this P with its equivalence given up here. Socrates is an Athenian only if, that's our material consequence, only if, same order, no changing order, nothing fancy, just replacing it piece for piece. Q, Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal. Okay, the comma says that that's the end of that sentence. Here's a new sentence. The new sentence is P, and P is just Socrates is an Athenian. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it here. Socrates is an Athenian. Logical consequence, we just replace that with therefore, and then Q, Socrates is mortal. All in the same order. You know, this is the magic of pseudo-English, is you don't have to really think about it that much. You just replace part for part. And then if you want to make it sound a little more natural, we can change the only if construction to an if then construction. We can say if Socrates is an Athenian, then Socrates is mortal. And this stays the same. Socrates is an Athenian. That's our second premise. And then we can conclude Socrates is mortal. And we know that this is a valid argument because modus ponens is valid. So whatever we put in for P and Q, doesn't matter. As long as they're propositions, we know that the argument's valid. Okay. All right, so that's modus ponens. Let's take a look at denying the antecedent. So this is another form. So this is our second form. Modus ponens is also known as affirming the antecedent. Let me talk a little bit about why we call it affirming the antecedent. We look at the first premise. It is material consequence. It has an antecedent and a consequent. P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. And we affirm the antecedent. We say that the antecedent is true in the second premise. That's why modus ponens is called, also known as affirming the antecedent. Denying the antecedent goes like this. So denying the antecedent, the first premise is the same as modus ponens, affirming the antecedent. So the first premise is the same. P is the antecedent, and Q is the consequent. P is the antecedent, and Q is the consequent. And in the second premise, we deny or negate the antecedent of the first premise. Thus, this form is called denying the antecedent. Okay. And we can do a truth table for this as well. Just has two variables. And the same setup. Copy over the values of P, skip material consequence, copy over the values of copy over the values of Q, do material consequence. All right, that's all the same as what we had in modus ponens. I'm going to do underscore and a space and paste that down. Do the values of P, negate those, and that's going to be the dominant operation. All right. And underscore for the logical consequence, and a space for negation. Copy over the values of Q and negate those. And now we look for significant rows. First interpretation is not significant. Second interpretation, not significant. Third interpretation, significant, and we have a false conclusion. This form is invalid. Okay. And now, the fourth row also is significant, and in that row, the conclusion is true, but if there's even one interpretation where the premises are true and the conclusion false, the argument form is invalid. So, if we're thinking about denying the antecedent, that argument form, as a pattern or template, anytime we see an argument that fits this form, we're just going to recognize it and we're going to say, oh, that argument's invalid. And this form does come up quite a bit. It comes up so often. The people make this mistake so frequently in their reasoning that it is one of the common formal fallacies. So whenever, even in less technical courses that involve logic, like a critical thinking class, often will cover fallacies. Denying the antecedent is one of those fallacies that always makes the list. It's just a formal fallacy, which can be demonstrated through a truth table. And what's tricky about it is that there is this fourth case or fourth interpretation where the conclusion is true, and that, if you're thinking, when you're working out a problem, and if you're thinking of this interpretation, you can be fooled into thinking that the argument is valid. But there's this alternative interpretation that you may be overlooking, and that's the gotcha. Okay, so this is invalid. So it's really helpful to recognize this as an invalid form, because this is a pitfall that human beings just naturally fall into for some reason. Okay, so that's denying the antecedent. These now are this complete list of common argument forms. This is the list that we want to memorize and get familiar with and be able to recognize these forms as they appear in arguments that look more complex but follow these general patterns or templates. And this is going to be key to what we study throughout the rest of the term, throughout the rest of this course. So make sure you start to memorize those, and that'll be in chapter 20. So make sure that you do spend some time with these flashcards. Memorize it. You can skip the flashcards and not memorize it now, but through the repetition of the exercises and quizzes, you will eventually memorize them. But it's a lot easier if you just memorize them up front, at least somewhat.